With the GameCube's library slowly being made playable on the Switch too, we thought now would be a good time to revisit some of the system's most iconic games. From Wind Waker to Metroid Prime, Kirby Air Ride, Animal Crossing, F-Zero GX, and more. GameCube was one of Nintendo's best consoles, but at only 22 million units sold, it's also one of its worst selling. It's weird to think about, but it's possible more people will experience GameCube on Switch 2 than ever did on its original hardware. As usual, we translated a bunch of old Japanese magazines and interviews looking for rare trivia for this video, but we'll keep the intro short and get right to it. In 2003, Nintendo Dream magazine interviewed Wind Waker's composer Koji Kondo and HAL Labs composer Shogo Sakai, who worked on Smash Melee and Kirby Air Ride. Sakai interrupts the interview at one point to ask Kondo, why did you make Link hold the Wind Waker baton in his left hand? Kondo's like, well, Link's left-handed. He always holds his sword in his left hand. So what? Well, Sakai frequently flies to Europe for opera and concerts, and says real-life conductors never hold the baton in their dominant hand, meaning Link should have held the Wind Waker in his right hand, not his left. Apparently, no one on the Zelda team knew that, and Sakai kinda breaks their balls over it here. Kondo says he's not as much of an orchestra head, and that in middle school, he was more into playing Deep Purple covers in his garage band. As a matter of fact, you can hear Deep Purple's influence in some of the music he makes for Nintendo. You can draw a straight line from Deep Purple all the way to Wind Waker 30 years later. Kondo was about to list more bands after Deep Purple, but Sakai cut him off mid-sentence, which is unfortunate, because we would have liked to hear more influences. But yeah, maybe Kondo not being so much into orchestra led to Link holding the baton in the wrong hand, but the music itself more than made up for it. Elsewhere in that same magazine, Sakurai talks about how hard it was to make Kirby Air Ride. It started out as an N64 game revealed at Space World 95, 8 years before its release. It took several different forms till eventually it got cancelled, then rebooted as an entirely different project on GameCube, which Sakurai says isn't the same game at all, except the title and the fact Kirby rides a star. Even after starting over though, the next year yielded few results, and the game continued to flounder in development hell. Eventually, he was able to finish it in 2003 with a soundtrack that had taken even more work than his previous game. Smash Melee took 3 composers 8 months, while Air Ride took just as long with 4 composers. Sakurai was so proud, he made the unusual decision to release part of the soundtrack before the game, as a free CD packaged with this very magazine. The music really is fantastic, and if you're someone who makes your own playlists of Nintendo music, Air Ride is definitely worth pillaging. Interestingly, he did the exact same thing again while this video was in production, releasing some Air Riders tracks on the Nintendo Music app before launch. The move is still unusual. Mario Kart World's currently 3 months old, for example, and still hasn't found its way to the music app. Unfortunately, Air Ride itself wasn't well received back then, with average review scores around 6 out of 10, and only selling about 1 million copies. Compare that to Melee, which reviewed in the 9s and sold 5 times more. After that, Air Ride wouldn't get a follow-up till 4 console generations later. As we're writing this, the release of a Switch 2 sequel is imminent. Hopefully, it's received better than the original. In Nintendo Dream's 98th issue, Camelot Software's iconic Takahashi brothers talk about their work on Mario Golf and Tennis. When Nintendo makes a Mario Kart, maybe they'll go on a one-day field trip to get a feel for driving real-life go-karts. But the Takahashis take their jobs a bit more seriously. They say back when they were making Everybody's Golf for PlayStation, they trekked to America and took a class on course design from Tighe, one of the top 3 golf course architects in the world. Then they played golf with his son, who taught them putting physics, and later sent him in-game courses to get his professional feedback. The Takahashis don't mess around, and they used all that experience to evolve Everybody's Golf into Mario Golf, which they say turns the gentleman's sport into a party game. Then they further improved on the N64 version by getting good in real life. The brothers explain that improvements in the GameCube sequel came from them golfing a lot and learning how to actually do stuff, like put spin on a ball. Later in the interview, the magazine asks why they put, quote, that trans character in the game. They were referring to Catherine, who in the West we call Birdo. It's kinda controversial in the fandom whether she's actually trans or not, but in this interview, the Takahashi brothers do refer to her as trans. But anyway, they said there's 2 reasons they added her to the series. First, that Catherine originated in Doki Doki Panic, a game they loved, and got absorbed into the Mario universe when it transformed into Super Mario Bros. 2. But really, the main reason's because they wanted to give her some fun animations, like after she gets a hole-in-one. They also made her balls trail rainbows. She's been in every Mario Golf since, though she got demoted to an NPC in the latest Switch iteration. In Nintendo Dream's March 2003 issue, Yoshio Sakamoto and Kensuke Tanabe discuss Metroid Prime and Fusion's development. Americans remember November 18th, 2002 as the glorious day both games launched simultaneously, but in every other region, they released weeks and months apart. Today we'll mostly cover what they say about Prime and save Fusion details for a later video. Prime hit Japan 3 months after it came out in America, and Sakamoto says, quote, we changed a lot for Prime. There were things we had to give up in order to meet the release date for the US version, and we added those in the Japanese version. Back in those days, it was usually the other way round. Americans got games later and in exchange got a more refined product. But Prime was made by Retro Studios in Texas and took months to localize for Japan. Sakamoto says they removed a lot of hints from the Japanese version because the point of Metroid is to wander around. The American version's frequent waypoints made progression quicker, but robbed players of some of Metroid's essence. He says Americans only got as many hints as they did because the US marketing staff wanted to make the game easier. The difficulty was ramped up in other ways as well. Japanese enemies had higher HP and dropped fewer items like health pickups. A lot of Nintendo games are made harder for Americans, but Prime was a rare reversal of that policy. Japan also got a 1-minute monologue from Samus that got cut from the American version.
10 years ago, below the surface of planet Zebes, the mercenaries known as space pirates were defeated by interstellar bounty hunter Samus Aran.
Sakamoto says the guys at Retro didn't like it, but because Japanese fans couldn't understand the language, to them it sounded cool, and they just kinda assumed it was good. Like when Americans watch anime in Japanese and are ill-equipped to detect weird subtleties or bad acting. Japan also made the entire game world brighter. According to Tanabe, Retro's office was dimly lit, which made their TVs look brighter. Nintendo's office was lit better, which conversely made the game look too dark. So they cranked up the in-game brightness for the Japanese version. They also changed the phase-on suit animation. The Retro guys thought Samus's hand twitching was cool, but Nintendo thought it was dumb and changed it. We checked later re-releases and noticed the Japanese animation was also used in Europe, all Wii versions, as well as Switch remasters, which means the original phase-on suit animation only ever appeared in the American version on the Cube. Putting Japanese changes aside and talking more generally, Sakamoto says he kind of felt like the series ended with Super Metroid, as the death of the final Metroid made for a fitting finale. But when they eventually decided to make Prime, he felt as long as Metroid's in the title, they had to include the titular aliens. Quote, I was certainly concerned about that when I was making Prime, but Metroid was absolutely necessary as part of the game's title, and changing it to Samus would have been lame. Ultimately, they made it a prequel, so Metroids aren't extinct yet. But it's weird to think if they had gone the other direction and changed the franchise name to Samus. He goes on to say Retro's passion for Metroid was, quote, insane, and that he was seriously concerned about their health. The crunch was brutal, as we discussed at length in our History of Retro Studios video. Throughout the interview, Sakamoto talks about who Samus is. In his mind, she looks a lot like Charlize Theron. As for personality, Samus isn't macho, but actually rather feminine, with a passionate heart. He says for him, Metroid's a franchise that tells the story of Samus as a person, and that if the series continues, he'd like to showcase that more in the future. That desire would ultimately lead to Other M, a game most fans didn't like, in part because they'd always thought of their silent protagonist as more stoic and badass. And finally seeing her as Sakamoto saw her kinda gave him the ick. In an interview on Shigesato Itoi's website, Miyamoto says Pikmin was mind-bendingly tricky to make because it did things no game had ever done before, and Nintendo's programmers didn't think were possible. Like dozens of characters working together to carry one large object, for example. Miyamoto says, "It was difficult to get rid of preconceived assumptions, so I forbid the team from using game industry jargon. To free their minds of what was possible and how a game's supposed to be made, he banned words like random from the job site. Quote, I said, stop using those words. We tried to create a game without using terms like enemy, ally, or fight. If you've played Pikmin, you'll see this reflected in the game itself, where arguably you are the villain massacring local wildlife and their offspring who were just minding their own business, so you can harvest their corpses for your own personal benefit." Consistent with Miyamoto's design philosophies, he also says the story came late in the process. Like most of his works, the gameplay was cooked up first, then the simplest bit of story was wrapped around it to provide player context. Quote, "Some games go with the approach of starting with the world first, but making a game while grappling with an already established world isn't what we did with Pikmin. I wanted to create just the basic framework for Pikmin's gameplay, then figure out what kind of world would be more suitable and what would be needed as a minimum. So I added the shipwreck story because it was the simplest and easiest to understand." He wanted an isolated setting for the real-time puzzle gameplay, and a story about crash landing in space was the simplest, quickest way to make it happen. That's classic Miyamoto, and part of what sets Nintendo games apart from something like Naughty Dog's Last of Us or Bethesda's Fallout franchise. Itoi's website also has an Animal Crossing interview covering how the devs made a game that didn't fit any pre-existing genre. Games are usually made with everyone sectioned off to work individually, but for Animal Crossing, they tore down the partitions so everyone could talk to each other and exchange ideas. Then they put a big desk in the middle for everyone to gather at 5:30 and have snacks, and share some of their weirdest ideas. That's where Mr. Rossetti was born, at the snack desk. Despite all their weird stuff that did make it into the game, they say about 80% of their ideas were too dumb to include. One that barely made it in, though, was a shirt soaked in blood, but they changed its name to the Tomato Juice shirt to do away with the idea you're a murderer or something. When Animal Crossing was localized for the West, it got removed from the game entirely and replaced with the Fishbone shirt. In a 2003 issue of Nintendo Dream magazine, Hideo Kojima talks behind the scenes for Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes. Nintendo was desperate to sign third parties at the time, and Miyamoto personally went to Kojima and asked him to make a GameCube Metal Gear. Kojima considers Miyamoto his master, so he obliged and decided to remake the PS1 original. But he gave the job of directing cutscenes to film director Ryuhei Kitamura. Kojima liked Kitamura's movies, and Kitamura liked Kojima's games, so it was a natural alliance. In this interview, Kojima says motion capture took 2 months, which is how long filming a lot of actual movies takes, and that Twin Snakes was the first video game to ever use an air ram. That's the thing that makes actors fly in the air when they get blown up. I'm sure you've seen it in action movies. Apparently air rams were too dangerous and expensive to use in Japanese films at the time, but Kojima and Kitamura were thrilled to get their hands on one. Kitamura ended up casting Kojima as an extra in his movie Azumi, as one in a group of mercenaries. Although, honestly, we watched the scene he's meant to be in 10 times, frame by frame, and we can't spot him anywhere. Maybe he got cut out in editing, or maybe we're just blind. Let us know in the comments if you can spot him. And the last magazine we'll touch on features Toshihiro Nagoshi, the director of Super Monkey Ball and F-Zero GX. He was also head of Sega's studio Amusement Vision. After Dreamcast died in 2001, Sega dropped out of the console wars and developed GameCube's only third-party launch title, Super Monkey Ball. It's actually an expanded port of an arcade game Nagoshi made the year before, simply called Monkey Ball. After launch, Sega's customer surveys revealed 60% of the people who bought Super Monkey Ball were elementary schoolers and 20% were girls. Nagoshi said it came as a huge surprise, since girls almost never make up such a large share of a game's customer base. Super Monkey Ball also established a direct relationship between Nagoshi and Nintendo. Sega had long had a strong presence in arcades, but at this point, Nintendo didn't have much to speak of. We thought bringing GameCube games into the arcade market might be an option, says Nagoshi. And I thought I might as well make a new game for it too. So Sega, Nintendo, and Namco combined forces to make the Triforce arcade system. Basically, an arcade board based on GameCube. Nagoshi pitched several ideas for Nintendo arcade games, and the one they agreed to was F-Zero, which would ultimately release on GameCube as F-Zero GX, and in arcades as F-Zero AX. Fans could use GameCube memory cards to exchange data and unlock new vehicles and racetracks in the GameCube version. GX got the highest review scores of any F-Zero ever released, and many consider AX Nintendo's best arcade game of all time. So what were Nagoshi's other pitches? He refuses to reveal details, except that none of them were Mario. But we can try and infer some possibilities. Glancing through Nintendo's portfolio of IP, Wave Race and 1080 snowboarding would have lent themselves well to arcades, but Nintendo had just released a new Wave Race and were then working on a new 1080. So a more likely candidate's probably Star Fox, and it's fascinating to think what Nagoshi could have done with the series. Unfortunately, in the GameCube era, Star Fox ended up fading into irrelevance instead. Namco announced Star Fox Assault a few years later, along with a Triforce arcade version. Star Fox AX, essentially. But the GameCube release got low reviews and sold poorly, and the arcade version never came out. On a side note, Nagoshi didn't pitch any Mario games, but Namco made Mario Kart Arcade GP for Triforce Arcade a few years later, which was fantastic and spawned a few sequels over the next decade. Gaming Press hoped they'd get ported to Wii U, but that never happened, leaving an entire subseries quarantined to arcades, most of which are in Japan. Who knows, maybe someday they'll find their way to Nintendo Switch Online. As for Nagoshi, in this interview he says he tried taking the Nintendo entrance exam, so he could switch teams from Sega over to the Big N. They would have been lucky to have him, but when he found out he'd have to move to Kyoto for the job, he decided not to go through with it. After that, he created the Yakuza franchise and lots of successful sequels, then left Sega to form his own studio in 2021. Since then, he's been vocal about wanting to make a new F-Zero, but it seems Nintendo's not interested. GX remains the franchise high point, and aside from F-Zero 99, it was the last in the series ever released, over 20 years ago.
Did you know? A microscopic image of a dolphin appears on a computer chip hidden deep within the GameCube system. This is in reference to the Nintendo GameCube's codename, the Dolphin, which is also referenced in many of the console's games. In one of the system's launch titles, Pikmin, the main character Captain Olimar pilots a spaceship called the Dolphin, and in Super Mario Sunshine, most of the game takes place on an island in the shape of a giant dolphin called Isle Delfino. Some speculate that the water-centric themes of Mario Sunshine as well as Legend of Zelda Wind Waker tie back into the Dolphin's name as well. The machine's GPU was even given the Dolphin-inspired name Flipper by the hardware design company ArtX, who helped with the GameCube's creation. Prior to this codename, the successor to the Nintendo 64 was internally referred to by Nintendo as N2000. Unusually, the GameCube has an abbreviation GCN in the West, despite the fact Japan uses the more sensible NGC abbreviation to stand for Nintendo GameCube. What's also interesting about the GameCube's development is that Nintendo developed and patented an early prototype motion controller for the console. The motion controls went so far into development that the game developer Factor 5 experimented with them for potential use in their launch titles. A similar situation occurred with Nintendo and Factor 5 during the development of the Nintendo 64. Factor 5 wanted to use the Nintendo 64 expansion pack to improve Star Wars Rogue Squadron's graphics, but Nintendo only wanted the pack to be used with hardware peripherals. After seeing the graphical benefits that the expansion pack gave to Turok 2 Seeds of Evil, however, Nintendo decided to allow Factor 5 to use the expansion pack. The GameCube itself released after about 4 years of development and was helmed by Dr. Wei Yen, a graphical engineer who had been the head of Nintendo Operations SGI, the department responsible for the Nintendo 64's fundamental architectural design. The GameCube's final design strangely has code referencing Nintendo 64 peripherals, such as the rumble pack and memory card, and even obscure peripherals such as the keyboard and mouse. Chunks of text containing these strings can be found as leftovers in various games like Wario World. A version of the GameCube service disc can also detect Nintendo 64 controllers. Nintendo created a variety of tech demos during development of the GameCube in order to show off its upgraded graphical capabilities to game developers. An interactive demo released in 2002 takes place in a new version of Princess Peach's castle, specifically showing off things like large textures, lighting and shadows, anti-aliasing, and a large number of polygons on screen all at once. Earlier in the year 2000, during the gaming event Space World, another tech demo shown was Meowth's Party. It was an animated music video with 3D Pokémon character models and a more detailed model of Meowth holding an electric guitar. Fans initially theorized that this was a teaser for a new Pokémon game, but that seems not to be the case. It was likely based on an ending sequence for the Japanese dub of the Pokémon anime series, which aired almost a year earlier than the tech demo. A similar sequence was seen again many years later in the GameCube game Pokémon Channel as the final part of an exclusive anime episode titled Pichu Bros in Party Panic, where Meowth's movements are different upon each viewing. Meowth's Party was also referenced in Super Smash Bros. Melee as a trophy. The GameCube was the first major console in Nintendo's history to not launch with a game where Mario is the protagonist. Instead, Luigi's Mansion was developed as the system's Mario Universe game. After the GameCube's worldwide release in 2002, players began to unlock some interesting secrets found right in the system's startup screen. The most well-known of these secrets can be triggered by holding down the Z button on the controller while the startup intro animation plays. However, another set of sound effects will play when holding down the Z button on 4 controllers plugged in at once, with an old-fashioned Japanese-style flair to it. The soft reflections on the logo's graphics also share a fun secret. The texture mapped onto them is the same texture used for all shiny objects, and the Nintendo 64 logo in the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. When on the menu screen itself, a slow ambient tune is heard in the background. Speeding it up by about 19 times normal speed reveals the slow series of tones is actually the Famicom Disk System startup jingle. Nintendo has a history of unique and interesting marketing campaigns for promoting their new consoles. The catchphrase used during the GameCube's official reveal at E3 was, "The Nintendo Difference." The purpose of the phrase was to distinguish themselves from the competition as an entertainment company first and foremost. Later, advertisements pushed the slogan, "Born to Play," and commercials for upcoming games featured a rotating cube animation that morphed into the system's logo and ended with the voice that whispered, "GameCube." In what was possibly the most bizarre piece of advertising was a contest titled, "What Would You Do for a Nintendo GameCube?", where fans were picked to perform stunts that they'd chosen in order to prove themselves as the most dedicated Nintendo fan. The 5 finalists who made it to the competition on November 1st, 2001 in San Francisco had a collection of incredible acts. They included a man from Illinois who proposed to his girlfriend while they were dressed up as Mario and Princess Peach, a man from New York who juggled several Nintendo systems while dressed up as Mario while whistling the Mario theme, a little boy from Wyoming who painted a Nintendo GameCube logo out of condiments only using his tongue, a girl from Arizona who ate a Nintendo GameCube-sized replica of uncooked Spam, chocolate syrup, and cat food. And finally, the grand prize winner, Corey Olksberry from Texas, who shaved his head, painted himself blue with a leaf on his head to look like a Pikmin, and ate a bowl of worms and crickets. Olksberry won a prize pack including a GameCube, a Game Boy Advance, a collection of games, and $5,000 for his act.
Did you know? Nintendo may have originally planned to name the GameCube the Star Cube. Nintendo of America submitted 3 separate trademarks for Star Cube in 1999, and the name was even posted on the official Nintendo website for Sweden. However, Nintendo's American and Japanese offices denied any knowledge of the name. According to the Swedish site, the system's online network would have also been named Star Road, referencing an area of the same name in Super Mario World. Nintendo veteran Shigeru Miyamoto pushed for the console to keep its project name and simply just be called Dolphin. Despite his efforts, Miyamoto failed to gather support for this idea. Choosing the name GameCube and designing the system's logo was a collaborative effort between Nintendo's Japanese headquarters and Nintendo of America. This was to make sure the console's name and appearance would work internationally. Strangely, the GameCube is abbreviated as GCN in the West, even though it's abbreviated as NGC in Japan for Nintendo GameCube. This is likely because the abbreviation NGC is a trademark of the National Geographic Channel in the United States, and is generally associated with National Geographic. The channel even files trademarks under the company NGC Network US when registering new shows. Another possibility for the difference between regions is that NGC was close to the abbreviation for the Neo Geo Pocket Color, NGPC, and Nintendo wanted to avoid any confusion or association. When making the GameCube, Nintendo wanted to create a system that looked like the ultimate gaming console, and not just another entertainment device that sat on a shelf. Several early designs were flatter than the GameCube, and one design even looked like a UFO. These designs kept leading to dead ends, however, so Nintendo looked at how gamers actually interacted with their consoles. Research at the time showed that Japanese families preferred smaller electronics in their household, and this data influenced Nintendo's designs. Most families had multiple TVs at home, and Nintendo wanted the system to be easy to take from room to room, or even to a friend's house. They decided to make the system compact and easy to hold to fulfill these needs. This is also why the system has a handle on its back. Although the GameCube's design had a mixed reception, its controller is often praised. The GameCube controller went through the most revisions of any Nintendo controller before it. The controller took 3 years to develop and was updated on a monthly basis. At one point, the B button was kidney-shaped like the X and Y buttons, and there was even a prototype controller that lacked a D-pad. While designing the controller, Miyamoto wanted to focus on the recognition of the joypad's main button, and making sure the player immediately knew which button was most important for playing games. The controller was also designed to have different distinct shapes for each button. This was so that players could know which button they were touching without having to look at the controller. In 2008, Nintendo almost faced a ban that would stop them from selling GameCube, Wavebird, and Wii Classic controllers. Nintendo lost a case that appealed against a $21 million patent infringement
wide-ranging lawsuit from a Texas-based company called Anescape. The patent seemed to be a generic patent relating to video game controllers and the application of analog controls, which Nintendo questioned the validity of. Because Nintendo lost the case, they were told that they would no longer be able to sell their controllers. However, they were allowed to continue selling their products while they took the case to the US Court of Appeals. The appeals court ultimately sided with Nintendo, and the company were free to continue producing and selling controllers. Nintendo had to deal with legal affairs of another kind early in the GameCube's life. Shortly before the console's release, Microsoft offered to buy Nintendo for $25 billion. Nintendo of America's then president, Minoru Arakawa, originally thought the offer was a joke, but once Microsoft's intentions were clear, Nintendo took the offer seriously and discussed the deal in Japan over 6 or 7 meetings. Microsoft wanted Nintendo to drop its console business and make games for the Xbox, but Nintendo's CEO at the time, Hiroshi Yamauchi, didn't like the idea and believed Microsoft lacked an understanding of the industry. Any chances of Microsoft's offer being taken died before the release of the GameCube. Although Nintendo turned down Microsoft's offer, they did forge business relationships with other gaming companies. After the GameCube's release, Nintendo and Sega teamed up to bring Phantasy Star Online Episodes 1 and 2 to the GameCube, complete with online play. However, their partnership led to some unintended damages. In October 2003, it was discovered that, when used with Phantasy Star Online, the GameCube's broadband adapter could channel unauthorized programs and code to the GameCube. This included retail GameCube games copied onto a computer, which opened the doors for piracy. Hackers found that when playing Phantasy Star Online, they could change some of the connection settings and access locations on their own computer instead of the game's official servers. This allowed them to stream their own code directly onto the GameCube. In response to this, Sega released an updated version of the game that fixed the exploit and made much of the game's online content available offline. Beyond online connectivity, Nintendo put an emphasis on Game Boy Advance connectivity while developing the GameCube. One game that would demonstrate the possibilities of GameCube and Game Boy Advance interaction was Stage Debut. Stage Debut was planned to work in sync with the Game Boy Advance's Game Eye add-on. The Game Eye was a camera which would allow people to take pictures and overlay these images on 3D models in Stage Debut. Although both Stage Debut and the Game Eye add-on were cancelled, the game inspired the creation of Nintendo's Mii characters. Another unusual set of GameCube add-ons released exclusively in Japan. The game Ohenro-san, Hoshin no Dojo, came with an optional mat and pedometer. Ohenro-san was a literal walking simulator and was made specifically for the elderly. The player could stand on a mat add-on and walk on the spot, causing the in-game images to progress in a Google Street View style fashion. Using the pedometer, players could also walk outside, then download its step count to the game to progress. Gamers would walk the grounds of 23 Japanese temples in the game. This was a sample of the 88 temples associated with the real-life Shikoku pilgrimage. As well as unusual add-ons, there was an entire GameCube console that wasn't produced by Nintendo. While developing the GameCube, Nintendo licensed the system's gaming tech to Matsushita, the company which owns Panasonic. This was part of a deal struck while Matsushita produced the optical disc technology for the GameCube. Because of this collaboration, Nintendo sanctioned Matsushita's development of the Panasonic Q. The Q was a Panasonic-branded GameCube capable of playing DVD movies, and although there was interest behind the idea of a DVD-compatible GameCube, the Q sold poorly and was discontinued in 2003. Due to the Q having a different shape to the GameCube, as well as legs on its base, the original Game Boy player couldn't be attached to it. Enough Panasonic Q owners complained about the incompatibility that Nintendo actually partnered with Matsushita to create a Game Boy player specifically for the Q. There was yet another device capable of playing Game Boy Advance games made for the GameCube. Mattel made a third-party Game Boy player rival called the Advance Game Port. The device is largely seen as inferior to the Game Boy player, as many games have audio and video issues. However, the Game Port did have a built-in action replay feature for cheats, as well as a save slot feature for saving anywhere.
Did you know? At one point, the Nintendo 64 could have been the Sega 64. Plans for the N64 originated when Silicon Graphics Inc., or SGI, approached Nintendo with their new energy-efficient and cost-effective CPU. However, Nintendo were not their first choice. The processor was initially shown to Tom Kalinske, then CEO of Sega America. After some debate among Sega's hardware designers, the company declined SGI's offer. This was due to uncertainties about the chip's performance and associated manufacturing risks. Kalinske advised SGI founder Jim Clark to contact other manufacturers, which led to a successful pitch with Nintendo. The contract between Nintendo and SGI was signed in August 1993, and work began the following month. The time between the project's inception and its eventual release in June 1996 was fraught with delays. The setbacks came from Nintendo, who wanted to ensure enough games and a solid marketing plan were ready at launch. Inevitably, these delays brought trouble with them. To prevent impatient fans from buying other consoles during the 1995 holiday season, Nintendo ran advertisements well in advance of the N64's release. These ads boasted that the Nintendo 64 was well worth the wait. Only if you want the best. Nintendo's confidence in the N64 partly came from a previous venture with Silicon Graphics technology, Donkey Kong Country. Country's visuals played a key role in its massive success and allowed Nintendo to compete visually with emerging 32-bit systems. And since Sega were recklessly diving into the next generation with the Saturn, Nintendo felt comfortable delaying the N64 by 6 months to ensure its quality. These delays inadvertently led to major developments in the World Wide Web. Jim Clark resigned from SGI in February 1994 and began brainstorming new ideas alongside a software engineer named Mark Andreessen. Encouraged by Clark's previous experience with Nintendo, their first idea was an online service for the N64. When they discovered the system wasn't intended to ship until late 1995 at the time, they went back to the drawing board. The next project they eventually settled on was the world's first commercial web browser, Netscape Navigator, which played a huge role in popularizing the internet as we know it today. Andreessen has himself speculated that the duo probably wouldn't have made Netscape had the Nintendo 64 released earlier than it did. The console was intended to launch under the name Ultra 64 in the West and Ultra Famicom in Japan. The Ultra title was possibly intended as a reference to the several toys Nintendo manufactured in the 1960s. The Ultra line of toys included the Ultra Hand, the Ultra Scope, and the Ultra Machine. These were an early success for designer Gunpei Yokoi, who would later work on the D-pad, Game Boy, and Metroid. While the industry speculated that the Ultra 64's name change was due to legal trouble with Konami, Nintendo offered another explanation. Nintendo 64 was a simple name that united the console under a single worldwide brand. The name was created by Shigesato Itoi, best known internationally for his work on Earthbound. He chose the name after hearing that people use Nintendo as a catch-all phrase for a game console, similar to how the name Hoover is used when referring to a vacuum cleaner. Itoi fell in love with the confident simplicity of the name Nintendo 64. In an interview with the Japanese magazine 64 Dream, he explained, "Instead of rashly trying to envision the near future or the next generation, I was hoping to name it something that would just force its opponent out of the ring head-on. When naming cars and coming up with sedans or whatever, you can't even keep track anymore. Super Excellent Sedan. It's disgraceful. So I made it the most orthodox name there is." Nintendo received criticism for using cartridges with the N64 as the rest of the industry had moved on to CD-ROM technology. The lack of memory in cartridges made high-quality audio and full-motion video challenging to produce. This inevitably led to third-party developers such as Capcom, Square, and Namco to favoring competing consoles over the N64. Nintendo justified their decision, arguing that the popularity of plug-and-play consoles was proof that a lack of load times was important to consumers. They also stated that using unique hardware made piracy more difficult on the N64. But other companies and critics were skeptical, accusing Nintendo of trying to maintain leverage over developers. Former chairman of Nintendo of America, Howard Lincoln, strongly denied the accusations. Lincoln said, "I've seen speculation about how this was some plot to control third-party publishers. That's completely nonsense. There's just not a grain of truth in that thing. No discussion like that ever occurred. That was never an issue. It was strictly technical technology and counterfeiting. However, Lincoln believed that CD technology was still improving and Nintendo could change formats as soon as discs became the better choice. Eventually, talented developers were able to compress full-motion video and high-quality audio onto N64 cartridges. Angel Studios in particular managed to compress Resident Evil 2 from 2 CDs onto a single cartridge. The team had some difficulty doing this and severely underestimated what it would take to compress over 200 unique pieces of music onto a single cartridge. Under-budgeted as a result, they turned to Factor 5, a company notable for their ability to compress complicated audio onto N64 cartridges. Factor 5 previously helped with speech compression in Pokémon Stadium and even managed to include full audio commentary for every level in Star Wars Episode 1: Battle for Naboo. This commentary was regarded as one of the first of its kind in video games. Despite the efforts of Nintendo and their partners, the cartridge format had undeniable drawbacks. Cartridges were approximately 10 times more expensive to produce than CDs and took 2 to 3 weeks to manufacture, whereas CDs took 2 to 3 days. To counter this, Nintendo considered letting players bring their cartridges to participating Lawson stores across Japan and replace the software on the cartridge with another game. Dubbed the Game Kiosk, the plan was intended to offset both production costs for Nintendo and inventory risks for their stores. Nintendo had implemented a similar concept with the Famicom Disk Writer and the Nintendo Power kiosks in Japan, which allowed for data on Famicom discs and Super Famicom carts to be rewritten. Many Nintendo 64 games began as projects for the Nintendo 64's short-lived disc peripheral, the Nintendo 64 DD. Miyamoto himself has mentioned this fact, claiming that almost every new project he started for the console was originally for the 64 DD. Reasons for the peripheral's repeated delays have been kept vague, with Nintendo citing difficulties in developing both the drive and the discs themselves. Although the 64 DD was released exclusively in Japan, a collector and YouTube user known as Metal Jesus Rocks acquired an American 64 DD from an anonymous seller. The model is noteworthy not only because it's American, but also because of the stickers on its case. The labeling suggested that it was retail ready, or at the very least, a retail prototype. This means Nintendo was far closer to selling the 64 DD stateside than anyone had realized before. A version of Super Mario 64 has also been discovered for the 64 DD. This version was made for Nintendo Space World 1996 to promote the 64 DD and was discovered in a Japanese pre-owned game store. The game has few differences to the cartridge version and seems to omit more than it adds, such as Mario's head being absent from the title screen.
Did you know Super Smash Bros. Didn't start out as a fighting game? According to series director Masahiro Sakurai, Smash was originally based on the traditional Japanese children's game Ohajiki, where points are scored by flicking marbles between other marbles. But over the course of the game's development, the original concept faded away as more and more fighting elements were introduced, like when Sakurai added the ability to knock opponents off screen, an idea he envisioned for Kirby's Dream Land but never implemented. The first working prototype of Smash Bros. Was called Ryuo Fighting Game, named after the city of Ryuo where the developers were based. Some fans claim Smash Bros.' original title was Dragon King the Fighting Game, but that's actually not quite correct. Dragon King is just a direct translation of the city's name, Ryuo. Calling it Dragon King the Fighting Game is like claiming a game called Los Angeles the Fighting Game is actually titled The Angels the Fighting Game, as Los Angeles means the angels in Spanish. Interestingly, Sakurai used his own personal camera to snap photos of the city for stage backgrounds in the prototype. These were mostly skylines, but he also snapped a close-up of a woman's crossed legs, which, just like the cityscapes, was used in the prototype. After 2 years in development, Smash 64 launched to critical acclaim and sold more than 1 million copies in Japan, so Nintendo laid out plans to export it overseas, eventually localizing the game into English, French, German, and Chinese. But during the localization process, some of the voice acting was cut from the original Japanese version, like Fox saying "mission complete" after obtaining a victory. One of the biggest differences were the Pokémon, whose cries got switched out with audio from local anime dubs. The Chinese localization was the strangest, with a mix of Japanese and English used for half the summonable Pokémon, while the other half got brand new cries, like Coughing, who yells Waza, and Venusaur yelling Zhongzi, which means seed. Most of the other Pokémon just made unintelligible sounds, because the Chinese anime didn't get proper cries until several years later. This is the same reason Jigglypuff never says her Chinese name. Instead, she switches back and forth between English and Japanese, making Chinese Jigglypuff the only bilingual Pokémon in the whole series. Except for the Chinese version, every region's localization of Smash 64 was comprised of totally unique character specifications. There's a secret technique known as momentum sliding that only exists in the original Japanese version. The maneuver is technically a glitch, which allows some fighters to slide backwards long distances, giving them a tactical advantage just like Melee and Ultimate's Wave Dash. When Smash Bros. Was updated from the Japanese to the American version, over 100 alterations were made to the character's stats for balancing purposes. For example, in America, Mario and Luigi are bigger, Kirby's smaller, and Link's sword is shorter. Captain Falcon runs faster, Samus's up smash is stronger, and Fox's blaster deals more damage. About 20 more technical tweaks were made in Australia, like Pikachu's thunder becoming more powerful, and Jigglypuff's rest getting nerfed with a much smaller hitbox. Fewer tweaks were deemed necessary by the time Europe's localization was finally complete, so it was nearly identical to the Australian version except for a few changes made to Link, like making him heavier and upgrading his forward smash with more damage potential. Melee received some technical tweaks internationally as well, but only a few dozen, and later Smash games didn't contain any tweaking around the world as they would have made online play virtually impossible. After the success of Smash 64, Sakurai asked Japanese fans who they'd most like to see added to the roster in a hypothetical Smash Bros. 2. When he tallied up the results, Bowser, Ganondorf, Falco, and Mewtwo were the most requested characters from their respective franchises, so they all found their way into Super Smash Bros. Melee. Interestingly, Slippy and Chocobos beat out Wolf and Sonic in their categories. Despite their victories, they were never added to the roster even to this day, even after Wolf and Sonic made their way into Brawl. Out of all 64 characters in Sakurai's poll, only 6 have yet to appear in the Smash series, either as fighters or smaller roles like spirits or assist trophies. Those 6 characters are Doraemon, Crash Bandicoot, Fire Emblem's Ogma, James Bond and Alec Trevelyan from 007, and the Blast Corps. In case you don't remember the Blast Corps, they were the heroes of an N64 game by the same name, who were forced to destroy everything in the path of a runaway nuclear missile carrier, or else it would explode. Blast Corps was developed by Rare, and was fairly popular back in the 90s, but never got a sequel, leaving it to slowly fade from gamers' collective memory over the decades. However, internal data suggests the Blast Corps were actually planned to make their Smash series debut in Ultimate as spirits, but for unknown reasons, they ended up getting cut before the game was finished. This may have been due to their IP belonging to Rare, and by extension Microsoft rather than Nintendo. Doraemon was probably rejected for not being a video game character, but if history's any guide, Crash and Smash will probably happen sooner or later, especially now that almost a dozen Crash games have spun their way onto various Nintendo consoles. Ogma is probably one of the more surprising exclusions, since he hails from Fire Emblem, a series many fans say is overrepresented in Smash. Despite placing on Sakurai's Smash 2 poll, Ogma's never made an appearance in any Smash game. As for James Bond and Alec Trevelyan, Sakurai has indicated 007 characters will probably never join the roster due to licensing concerns. However, GoldenEye's Proximity Mine did make it into Smash 64, although its name was changed to the Motion Sensor Bomb in most localizations outside Japan. And another item from GoldenEye almost made it into Melee. Unused images and sound effects for timed mines can be found in Melee's internal data, and presumably would have functioned just like they did in GoldenEye, latching onto a surface then exploding a few seconds later. But that's not the only secret hidden in Melee's internal data. There's also unused menu text indicating several scrapped game modes, which were uncovered by Did You Know Gaming's own Push Dustin. One mode would have granted access to the Smash Bros. Dojo, providing players with tips and tricks on how to improve their skills and learn new techniques. Another mode was Trophy Battles, with text telling players they could exchange trophies with a friend. Unfortunately, the game's unused text doesn't explain how exactly Trophy Battles would have worked, but hopefully someday a new discovery, leak, or developer interview will paint the full picture. While Melee was in development, Sakurai planned for every Nintendo franchise represented in the roster to receive 2 stages each, what he described as one front stage and one back stage. The front stages were more straightforward and geared towards competitive play, while the back stages were more fun and gimmicky. For example, Peach's Castle was the Mario series' front stage, while Rainbow Cruise was the series' backstage. All the stages in the upper row are the front stages, while the stages beneath them are the back stages. But Sakurai's original vision didn't turn out quite like he'd planned. Melee only ended up with one Ice Climber stage as the second got scrapped late in development. Sakurai never provided a description of the lost level, and neither has game data or leaks for that matter, but presumably it was the front stage that got cut, since Icicle Mountain is somewhat gimmicky. Melee also didn't feature any Fire Emblem stages, because the only stage that had any work put into it ended up getting cut too. The Smash series stage count has exploded from just 29 in Melee to over 100 stages in Ultimate, but there's still one character who's never gotten a stage of his own: Rob the Robot. Every Smash game has featured content from other IPs long before said IP's content appeared in their own games. Just to name a few examples, the Falcon Punch was invented for Smash 64, but wasn't part of F-Zero canon until the F-Zero anime. In the final episode, Captain Falcon unleashes a massive Falcon Punch on series villain Black Shadow. Roy appeared in Smash Bros. Melee before he was ever seen in a Fire Emblem game. Armored mechs known as Geckos made their worldwide debut on Shadow Moses Island in Smash Bros. Brawl, almost half a year before they made their first appearance in a Metal Gear game. Smash for 3DS featured English music from Fire Emblem Fates before its release in 2015, and Smash for Wii U featured the Woolly World stage a full 7 months before the release of Yoshi's Woolly World. And in Smash Ultimate, fans got to use the Poltergust G100, the Slam, and Suction Shot from Luigi's Mansion 3, even though Luigi's Mansion 3 didn't release until the following year. In fact, all this content was first seen in Simon's reveal trailer, over a month before Nintendo announced Luigi's Mansion 3 was even in development. Goku's been at the top of fans' wish lists ever since non-Nintendo characters like Sonic and Snake were added to the roster in Brawl, but in 2019, Sakurai shut down the possibility once and for all, telling fans he's heard them begging for Goku, but Smash only has room for video game characters. Even if they've appeared in their own games, anime characters like Goku and Doraemon are never gonna make the cut as long as he's in charge. So Dragon Ball fans might have to wait for Sakurai's retirement to see Goku rain down Kamehamehas on Kirby and Pikachu, but for now they can at least take some comfort in hearing his voice. Goku's voice actor Sean Schemmel's been playing Lucario in Smash ever since Smash 4, but this isn't the only crossover. In total, there's more than 50 actors whose voices connect Smash Bros. To Dragon Ball. The full list is too long to cover, but in addition to Goku, some highlights include Gohan, who voices Ryu in Ultimate. Piccolo also plays Roy, Vegeta plays Captain Falcon, and Cell plays both Knuckles and Guile. Some of Smash Ultimate's alternate costumes represent Pokémon forms that are now completely unobtainable in the latest generations. One of Pichu's alts is Spiky-Eared Pichu, a time-traveling event Pokémon who can only be caught in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, and can't be traded or transferred, meaning Spiky-Eared Pichu is stuck forever in Generation 4, except for in Smash Ultimate. But electric mice aren't the only lost Pokémon who've taken refuge in the Smash series. About 20 Pokémon had unique shiny colors that were retired after Gen 2, like Charizard, who was originally purple and green, but was changed to black and red in all future generations. Charizard's modern shiny can't be found in Smash Ultimate, but its retired shiny was included as an alternate costume. The same can be said for Mewtwo. You can't play as its modern shiny, but you can play with its original shiny colors from Gen 2. In fact, Smash Ultimate is the only game released in the past 20 years where these retired shiny Pokémon still exist.
Did you know Virtual Boy wasn't Nintendo's biggest failure? Despite its reputation, it actually sold more than the Satellaview and 64DD combined, and outsold most of its 32-bit competitors like Atari Jaguar. But it could have sold so much more. Codenamed VR32, the system was envisioned by its creator as small and portable as a pair of sunglasses, where it would give birth to new genres in infinite darkness. But government regulations, Nintendo rushing it out before it was ready, then failing to support it after launch, all culminated in a Frankenstein's monster that wasn't what it was supposed to be. But even after all that, a lot of its games turned out pretty good, actually. Virtual Boy's become a meme nowadays, but if you dig through 90s magazines, you might be surprised at some of the review scores. Unfortunately, the old boy had his plug pulled after a few short months. So Nintendo could focus all their might on N64 defeating PlayStation, thus dooming Virtual Boy to the waste bin of history. In this video, we're going to look at its creation, tragically short lifespan, and why things turned out the way they did. This is the full story of the Nintendo Virtual Boy. Before we begin, it's important to understand the context of the Virtual Boy's origins. Looking back nowadays, some people think of it as an aberration. In the 90s, there were home consoles and handhelds, but Virtual Boy was neither. They think of it as a weird, one-of-a-kind machine. But actually, it was just one relative in a long bloodline. Its most ancient ancestor was the Vectrex 3D imager. It launched in 1984 and offered gamers their first glimpse into stereoscopic 3D. In 1987, Nintendo released the Famicom 3D system, and Sega put out the Sega Scope 3D for Master System. Then in 1991, Sega announced they'd begun development on the next generation, Sega VR for Genesis. It's important to note, though, that those were all home console accessories. They weren't standalone systems, and certainly not portable. It was in that context that Shigeru Miyamoto started pestering Gunpei Yokoi to throw his hat in the ring. Our last video was Yokoi's life story, but in case you missed it, he'd been Nintendo's lead inventor since the 1960s, who nowadays is best known for Game & Watch and Game Boy. At the time, I was interested in virtual reality, remembers Miyamoto, and was one of the staff that went on and on about how we could do something with 3D goggles. I didn't exactly twist his arm, but I would talk to Yokoi about it. Nintendo president Yamauchi wanted Yokoi to explore it too. Eventually, he ordered him to do it. Nintendo games had always been 2D, but technology was getting to a point where 3D was the next logical step. So the plan was Nintendo would jump into the next dimension with 2 consoles, each from a different angle. Project Reality would make use of 3D polygons, while VR32 would use stereoscopic 3D. True virtual reality was technically possible, but would have been far too big, expensive, and Yokoi didn't think it well suited to Nintendo's visual style. Mario jumping 20 feet in the air, doubling his height with mushrooms, those kind of fantastical ideas just wouldn't translate to VR realism. Realistic visuals should never be our goal, said Yokoi. The essence of Nintendo games is seeing how much we can stimulate people's imaginations with symbolic distortions of reality. Yokoi tinkered around for a while, but it wasn't till a man from Massachusetts walked through his door that the project began in earnest. His name was Alan Becker. He'd invented a red light technology back in '86, with the idea it had fit over one eye for surgeons and aircraft mechanics when they need to consult vital signs or schematics, but their hands are busy. It was basically a primitive 80s version of Google Glass, if you remember what that is. It hadn't caught on though, so Becker started pitching the technology to game companies. Sega, Mattel, Hasbro, they'd all turned him down. But in 1991, Becker brought it to Nintendo, where Yokoi saw potential that others couldn't. At the time, Yokoi had grown dissatisfied with where video games were headed. He'd been at Nintendo since 1965, back when they mostly just made playing cards. It was largely thanks to his inventions that Nintendo evolved into the global gaming giant they are today. He'd seen the evolution of games from literal toys to simple handhelds to 8-bit consoles, then 16-bits, and soon it'd be on to 32, then 64. It had become a technological arms race, with console makers competing over graphics. But that's not what video games were about. Not to him. Making good games is about coming up with good ideas, he said in his biography. But companies have been using an escape route for their lack of ideas, better graphics, and more colors. Yokoi predicted the bit wars would lead to a future where the console market would get conquered by companies who could produce the best visuals. And that was a battle Nintendo wouldn't win. Time would eventually prove him right, as Nintendo's market share got chipped away by the likes of Sega and decimated by Sony. Yokoi believed if Nintendo was gonna survive, they'd have to leave the arms race behind and fight on the battlefield of ideas.
they'd have to make new kinds of games no one had ever seen before, and let everyone else compete on processing power. Yokoi was also a big believer in breaking games out of the confines of a TV screen. Back in the 70s, he made Wild Gunman and Duck Hunt that put a gun in your hand and ducks in your living room. His Famicom light gun, Rob the Robot, and Super Scope bled into reality as well. Game & Watch and Game Boy were the same idea, but in reverse, letting players escape the living room and play games out in the real world. The next portable system, codenamed VR32, was a further evolution of that idea, with games literally popping off the screen and into your eyeballs, wherever you wanted to take it. It'd be as small as a pair of sunglasses you can slip on anywhere. Yokoi likened it to how people had spent decades listening to music at home. Then Sony's Walkman came along in 1979, and suddenly they could take music with them. Hearing your favorite song on a train while staring at the sunset hits completely different than hearing the same song at home. Scientifically speaking, it sends a whole other rush of chemicals into your brain. Sony opened up a whole new world for music, and now Nintendo was going to do it for 3D. VR32 would also have motion tracking, so wherever you moved your head, it'd move your in-game perspective. Yokoi was especially fascinated by the total blackness that surrounded a user's vision. He told kids who spend all day in front of their TVs to try walking out their back door at night. The same yard that seemed so ordinary in daylight, now that it's draped in darkness, feels like a separate reality, with an inescapable sense that something inhuman lurks in the shadows. There are more thrilling spaces in utter darkness, he said, than there are in video games on a TV screen. That's the space VR32 would inhabit, and give birth to entirely new genres. Yokoi's biography says, for example, if you used it out in the hills, nocturnal creatures like tanukis and foxes that hide during the day would appear on the screen, and you'd play a game where you catch them. In short, VR32 would offer unprecedented kinds of gameplay and draw in people who weren't even gamers, just like Game & Watch and Game Boy had done in the 80s. The system was designed by Yokoi's department, Nintendo R&D 1, who also made a lot of its titles. In addition to Game & Watch and Game Boy, they'd also made a lot of the company's most famous games, including all the Metroids, Super Mario Lands, Famicom Detective Clubs, and a whole lot more. Basically, almost every game Nintendo had ever made up to that point, except the ones by Miyamoto. Miyamoto was keen to make games too, though. It was him, after all, who wanted Yokoi to make VR32 in the first place. Prior to release, he told Famitsu, "My goal is something so amazing, people aren't sure if they can even call it a video game. I want to make something with the power to pull in all kinds of ordinary people, the way Space Invaders and Super Mario did." In that same interview, Miyamoto said he was also thinking about porting over Star Fox 2, which was originally developed for Super Nintendo, but now he thought maybe it'd be a better fit for VR32. So, all that to say, between R&D 1's hardware experience, their track record of hit games, and Miyamoto himself getting in on the action, VR32 was on track to be an awesome machine with mind-blowing games. Unfortunately, there were some hiccups during development, and the final product didn't turn out as Yokoi envisioned. Much of the blame can be laid at the feet of government regulations. A radio law forced him to add a metal shield between the system and the user's head to protect from radio waves that, at the time, were thought might be harmful to people's brains, which meant VR32 would have to be a lot bigger than a pair of sunglasses. Another problem was Japan's new product liability law, which basically said companies could be sued if consumers got injured using their products. If a kid walked into traffic with VR over his eyes, legally, it would be Nintendo's fault when he got hit by a bus, which meant VR32 could no longer be a wearable. it had to comply not just with Japanese law, but America's FCC and other regulators around the world. So the system had to get bigger, heavier, and unwearable, which means it couldn't have head tracking either. The machine they ended up with weighed 2 pounds and had to rest on a 2-legged stand. Instead of slipping it on anywhere, now gamers would have to leave it at home and lean over to stick their faces in. It was a far cry from Yokoi's original vision, and the backyard at midnight ideas he dreamed of were no longer possible. Instead, VB Games would have to focus on traditional pick-up-and-play games like 2D Mario, Pinball, and Tetris. It was the blue ocean strategy, growing the market by appealing to regular folks. That stood in contrast to the red ocean, where all game companies fought for the same shrinking customer base of hardcore gamers, like sharks feeding on a dwindling supply of fish. Yokoi still hoped it'd breed new kinds of games too, but they'd have to exist in Virtual Boy as it was instead of what it was supposed to be. A tough situation was made worse though when Nintendo started pressuring him to release it sooner than he wanted. In 1993, Sega showed off Sega VR, which looked almost ready for market, and a wave of 32-bit competitors would soon follow, from 3DO and Atari Jaguar to Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. Super Nintendo's 16-bit graphics looked ancient in comparison, and Nintendo 64 wasn't going to be ready till 1996. Nintendo wanted to release a new system as soon as possible to keep their investors happy and maintain relevance. Yokoi didn't think it was ready yet, but the call wasn't his to make. In April 94, President Yamauchi made the big announcement and said it would be playable at Space World later that year, and hit store shelves a few months later. Press foretold of an imminent battle between Sega VR and Nintendo VR32 as a new battlefield in the gaming wars.
Not 100% won over, but I want to give it a chance, and I want to see what other games are coming out for it.
Space World 94. Yamauchi climbed on stage and praised its innovation and affordability. At $200, the newly renamed Virtual Boy was going to sell for less than half the price of other 32-bit systems like Saturn and PlayStation. 3 games were rushed out as demos: Galactic Pinball, Telero Boxer, and Mario Bros. VB. Every gaming journalist from Tokyo to Timbuktu was there, eager to shove their face into Nintendo's new system. It's generally remembered that all press hated it. But if you go back and read magazines, the reception was actually pretty mixed. Some were fully on board for the 3D future, while others detested the black and red graphics. Yokoi told them in testing, color made a lot of users see double, while red only gave a better 3D effect and improved resolution. Giving it color also would have made its retail price over $500, which in today's money is over $1,000. A few magazines claimed that Virtual Boy was bad for your eyes, but Yokoi insisted they did extensive tests with Harvard eye doctors. And truth was, VB's actually good for your eyes. It's like a workout for your eyeballs. By switching focus from graphics up close and far away, you're literally stretching your eye muscles. Yeah, maybe your eyes would feel tired after a play session, but the same could be said for your arms after lifting weights. Yokoi said, if anything, it'll improve your eyesight, but no one paid him much attention. Another criticism was that playing Virtual Boy is too much of a solitary experience. Your friends can't watch or give advice because you're in your own little world. Nintendo promised a link cable would soon make multiplayer possible, but in their rush, they didn't finish the link cable in time for Space World. Ultimately, the system's solitary nature was one of the reasons it failed to catch on. How many times have you bought a system after seeing your friend play it, or because you had a blast playing together? It's a form of free marketing that Virtual Boy just didn't get. 3D graphics couldn't be reproduced in TV or magazine ads either, further limiting how many people could see it and believe it. All that said, what often gets overlooked nowadays is what people universally liked about Virtual Boy. Edge magazine was one of Virtual Boy's biggest haters, but even they wrote up the controller as innovative and comfortable thanks to its M-shaped design. Ergonomically, it was far ahead of its time, and no other controller came close. It also had dual D-pads, enabling gameplay that wasn't possible on other systems. PlayStation, for example, originally shipped with one D-pad, and didn't go dual analog till mid-97. It was rather fitting that Nintendo got there first, seeing as Yokoi invented the modern D-pad back in the Game & Watch era. Virtual Boy was also widescreen, a decade before the norm. Technically, with a 12:7 aspect ratio, it wasn't quite as wide as 16:9, but it was a heck of a lot wider than 90s home consoles. It also ran at 50 frames a second, and unlike most other systems, Virtual Boy was region-free, so you could play Japanese games on American systems and vice versa. Virtual Boy also had a unique audio feel, most comparable to a souped-up Game Boy, but with the added advantage of having two high-quality speakers for stereo sound. And while Game Boy only had 4 audio channels, Virtual Boy had 6, making it sound like this.
Welcome to Space World. Let's go.
So all that said, some in the press loved it, some hated it, and some things even the haters liked. But how was Nintendo feeling? Yokoi was starting to feel 50-50 about its chances, but Nintendo itself was exuding nothing but confidence. They projected in its first year it'd sell 3 million units in Japan, and another 1.5 million in America. That's more than Super Famicom sold in its first year. Nintendo pledged one new first-party game each and every month. Third parties were enthusiastic as well. More and more kept throwing their hats into the ring, from Squaresoft to Rare, till eventually about 100 were making Virtual Boy games. Even Game Freak was thinking about doing one. Perhaps the most enthusiastic developer, though, was Hudson Soft, who were probably most famous for their Bomberman franchise. They were the first third party to ever make video games for a Nintendo system back in 1984, and now they were all in on Red. Quote, "Our CEO is saying Virtual Boy is a business chance, and it's not an exaggeration to say Hudson is staking its future on it. VB Fever got so hot that Atari responded by announcing their own headset, Jaguar VR. Around the same time, Sega VR fizzled into vaporware, which meant at launch, Nintendo would have the market all to themselves. Virtual Boy had its haters to be sure, but a lot of magazines thought it was going to be huge, with page after page acting like it was descending from heaven to bless us with the future of gaming. Nintendo and third parties were spamming ads all over the place, from print to television.
初めての完全立体映像ゲーム機バーチャルボーイ誕生。左右の目に異なる映像を映すことでテレビゲームでは表現できない立体感を生み出した。テニス、ボクシング、マリオの立体アクションゲームなど同時発売。バーチャルボーイ ゲームの新しい時代が
Hype was reinforced by its launch in April 95, the same month as Satellaview. We did a 45-minute video on Satellaview a while ago, if you're not familiar with the add-on, but the point is, it beamed games down to Super Famicoms via satellite and furthered the sense that April was the month Nintendo was getting a jump start on the 21st century. In March, though, VB's release got pushed back a few months, but with the accompanying good news that instead of $200, now it was going to sell for $150. Across the pond, Nintendo of America told retailers it'd be one of the biggest launches of all time, with support from a $25 million ad campaign. Nintendo Power was gonna push it hard every month, along with ad buys in the most popular gaming magazines, radio commercials in the top 50 markets, and VB news segments shown on major airlines. The biggest ad campaign, though, was TV commercials.
It came from the third dimension with its own brain, its own voice, its own legs. There's only one problem. It needs your eyes. Virtual Boy, see it now in 3D.
Nintendo of America was also going on a mall tour across the country, setting up booths where passers-by could try out Virtual Boys. Demo stations were set up in Blockbusters nationwide, along with a promotion that let you rent a Virtual Boy and 3 games for 3 nights for just $10. After returning it to Blockbuster, you'd get a $10 coupon to buy a Virtual Boy of your own. So in effect, the rental was like a free trial you could take home for a few days. There were so many promotions, advertisements, and sweepstakes that we don't have time to go over all of them. But suffice it to say, Nintendo of America was throwing the kitchen sink at it, and it was confident that it would pay off. The big day was set for July 21st, 1995 in Japan, and a few weeks later in the US. Launch day was the moment of truth, so we're going to take a good look at all 5 launch titles, which sold for about $50 each. You've probably seen YouTubers take steaming dumps on these games, but for the historical perspective, instead of our own opinions, we'll see what magazines thought at the time of their release. Famitsu was basically the only Japanese magazine scoring games back then, and with 4 reviewers per game, they're Japan's gold standard for good reason. There were a lot more reviewers overseas, so we'll take their scores and average them out, to give you an idea what the consensus was in 1995. Okay, with all that said, let's get to the launch lineup. In America, Virtual Boys cost $30 more, but they came with Mario's Tennis as a pack-in title. Its sequels on N64 and GameCube are probably more famous, but the series actually got its start right here on Virtual Boy. In fact, it's the first sports game to ever have Mario in the title. Famitsu scored it 6.5, saying it played like a normal tennis game, in a good way, but with the benefit of great 3D depth. Keep in mind going forward that Famitsu generally scores games lower than their Western counterparts. From them, 5 basically means average. In the West, magazines scored Mario's Tennis in the high 7s, calling it a fun pick-up-and-play sports title. The game was generally well-liked, though the most common complaint was its lack of multiplayer. Earlier on, Nintendo announced it would have multiplayer, but the VB link cable got delayed again, and still wasn't ready on launch day. As a result, Mario's Tennis had to ship single player only. Galactic Pinball. There are 4 distinct tables, with one featuring Samus and her alien foes. setting the stage for Metroid Prime pinball a decade later. About half this game's dev team came over after making Super Metroid, including the composer. As a result, it's got probably the best soundtrack on the system, including a rendition of Super Metroid's prologue theme. Famitsu gave it a 6, liking the cheesy sci-fi vibes and clever mechanics, but docking points because they felt the puck was too slippery. Western outlets scored it mid-6s, saying it was fun in short bursts, but not a system seller. Tolero Boxer was directed by Yoshio Sakamoto, who also directed Super Metroid. Set in the 22nd century, it's basically Punch-Out, but with robots, and a deeper combat system. Each D-pad controls one fist, for blocking different kinds of punches, and so on. Famitsu scored it just under a 6, with points docked for not being able to move your feet. And also because it's only got 8 characters, while Super Punch-Out had 16, making this game feel a little rushed in comparison. Westerners scored it in the mid-6s, with some feeling it should have been branded as an actual Punch-Out game. Panic Bomber, a Bomberman puzzle game that played a lot like Puyo Puyo, made by Hudson Soft, the guys who publicly staked their future on Virtual Boy's success. Unfortunately, Famitsu considered it the weakest launch title and gave it a 5. They criticized it for failing to take advantage of the hardware and said there was no reason it even needed to be on Virtual Boy. They also drew issue with the lack of multiplayer, though that was really Nintendo's fault for not having the link cable available at launch. In America, Panic Bomber wasn't a launch title, but when it came out a few months later, it got a 6. Reviewers called it addictive and kinda fun, but would have preferred a real Bomberman instead. A lot of VB games were set in the future, and Red Alarm was no exception. A rogue AI's trying to wipe out humanity, which you've got to stop by flying through 6 levels and killing 6 bosses. It plays a lot like Star Fox All-Range mode, but uses both D-pads for precise maneuvering. It might look like a cluttered mess of red lines here on YouTube, but you'll have to take our word for it that in 3D, it makes more visual sense. Famitsu loved the graphics, proclaiming them cool, tasteful, and nostalgic for games of the past. They gave Red Alarm a 6.5 and recommended it as the best launch title of the bunch, saying it was even better than a lot of space shooters on PlayStation and Saturn. Overseas magazines scored it in the 7s, with GameFan going as high as a 9.5 and calling it one of the best games they've ever played. So, as you can see, contemporary reviews didn't pan the games as trash. On the contrary, they ranged from average to fantastic. A lot of magazines thought Virtual Boy had a bright future ahead of it, but they did worry that not having a big Mario, Zelda, or Metroid was going to handicap it at launch. The Metroid cameos in Galactic Pinball were nice, but an actual Metroid would have been better, and the system's dark graphics and sound chip would have paired well with the series' atmosphere. Some outlets were puzzled that Nintendo took their most experienced devs and had them make tennis, boxing, and pinball instead of something higher profile. A couple Mario games were coming soon, but not having them at launch was a problem. Yokoi was candid and told press it released before a good enough launch lineup was even ready. Another Japanese magazine, Famimaga, went to a popular game shop to see the long lines on release day. They were expecting enthusiasm on par with a typical Nintendo system, but were surprised when only 40 people showed up. They checked at another store, but the situation was the same there too. To be frank, there are very few VB users today, they wrote in what was supposed to be their big launch issue. However, if they can release games, that'll draw in fans. It'll raise the status of Virtual Boy and inevitably lead to more hardware and software sales. We don't want this to be the end. It was clear that hardcore gamers just didn't care about Virtual Boy, but that was exactly the demographic Yokoi wasn't going after. General entertainment publications mostly enjoyed it, like Popular Science and Entertainment Weekly, and kids liked it too. So he went to Yamauchi and said, "Let's stop courting gaming magazines who are run by enthusiasts and target the general public instead. That if we, quote, advertise Virtual Boys not for gamers, I think that could rekindle people's interest." Yokoi thought there was still a 50-50 chance he could turn things around and win over the Blue Ocean. As he saw it, that was the only hope for Nintendo's future, as they were doomed to lose the home console war. He practically begged for a $10 million ad budget to do just that, but he didn't get it. Only 17 more games ever came out. 4 of them landed in its second month, starting with Golf. Famitsu gave it 6.5, saying it made good use of 3D depth and otherwise was just a solid golf game. One of them called it a perfect game, helped along by the fact golf's a sport best played in solitude and thus a good fit for the hardware. Western magazines didn't see it that way though and gave it a 6. Another sports title released the same day, Virtual League Baseball was universally panned by critics. The graphics were ugly, it didn't make good use of 3D, and Famitsu said the computer opponent was, quote, a bit of a pain in the arse. They scored it less than a 5, while Western outlets gave it barely more than a 5. This one was supposed to have multiplayer too, but Nintendo still hadn't released the link cable. Another game from Hudson Soft, Vertical Force, is a pretty typical space shooter, but with a 3D gimmick that lets you switch between 2 altitudes, flying higher or lower to shoot, dodge, and duck under structures. All 4 Famitsu reviewers agreed it's a 6, except one guy who gave it a 3. Westerners gave it 5.5, saying it's a decent space shooter making good use of the hardware, but only fans of the genre should consider dropping $50 on it. V-Tetris comes with the classic Tetris we all know and love, but also includes a new mode as its main attraction. Basically, you've got to spin the board around on a circular plane to eliminate Tetronimos on all sides. It's an interesting twist, but Famitsu scored it just over a 5, saying the concept was doable in 2D and should have made more clever use of the third dimension. They also docked points for the lack of multiplayer. Once again, it was supposed to have multiplayer, but couldn't because no link cable. Western magazines didn't review V-Tetris, as it was the first of many that never left Japan. At this point, VB sales were continuing to flounder, and Yokoi was still trying to find ways to make it portable. He patented a VB shoulder mount that honestly doesn't even look feasible as something you'd want to take out of the house. But he was getting desperate. He'd saved Nintendo twice already, and now felt he had to one more time. But Nintendo never would have released the shoulder mount anyway because of the product liability law, and they were still dragging their feet even on the link cable. Rather than draw out the suspense, I'll just go ahead and tell you. Nintendo kept delaying it till eventually just never releasing it at all. Link cables should have been easy to produce, but Nintendo simply wasn't giving VB the resources it needed. Speaking of liability laws, they'd also forced Nintendo to stick a bunch of warnings in the VB instruction manual, saying it could cause headaches, blurred vision, and other problems. Yokoi pointed out that other systems have the same kind of warnings. PlayStation's manual says it could harm your eyes, cause eye strain, and users should take a 15-minute break every hour. N64 warns of dizziness, motion sickness, and lighting your house on fire. But nobody paid him any attention. Virtual Boy was a new kind of machine, so people did take its warnings seriously. The manual was just a collection of warnings, each more terrifying than the last, said Yokoi. If someone had the misfortune to read them, they'd think our machine was really dangerous for their health. By default, it was also made to ask players to take a break every 30 minutes. Even nowadays, when Switch tells people to take a break, they just ignore it. But when Virtual Boy gave the same prompt, some folks genuinely thought their eyes were going to get damaged. In truth, VB was good for your eyes, and the vast majority of players didn't get headaches. But the forced warnings furthered public perception that Virtual Boy was a death trap. The next month, September, only got 3 games. Jack Bros was made by Atlus as a spin-off of their Megami Tensei series. It was the first of the franchise released outside Japan, and paved the way for Persona and all of the rest. The 3 titular Jack brothers all play a bit differently, blasting their way through 60 maze-like floors, hunting for keys, and trying not to run out of time. The game uses the double D-pads like a modern twin-stick shooter, one for moving and one for aiming. Again, that was pretty impressive for its time, and wouldn't have been possible on other systems till 1997. Famitsu wasn't super keen on Jack Bros though, and gave it a 5. But the West praised its innovative controls, 3D depth, addictive gameplay, and gave it closer to an 8. Another game set in a sci-fi future, Space Squash, is basically tennis with jetpacks, where you can damage your opponent and grab pickups along the way. One D-pad moves, the other whacks balls in different directions. Space Squash never came stateside, but in Japan it got a 5, with Famitsu saying it was fun with good 3D, but felt a bit rushed and short on ideas. September also saw, at long last, the system's first mainline Mario. Mario Clash was made by R&D 1 as a reimagining of the original Mario Bros. Mario Bros. VB was just a rushed-out tech demo for Space World and never got released as an actual game. But this was the real deal. Mario Clash has 99 levels that, like the original, ask you to kill every enemy on screen to make progress. All 4 Famitsu reviewers gave it a 6, calling it simple and old-fashioned, but undeniably well-made and a good fit for the hardware. Western magazines gave it about a 7, saying it's addictive and fun, though a little too close to the source material. As a side note, Mario Clash had the same composer as Metroid 2, so the 2 games often sound a lot alike. The original Mario Bros. And Mario Clash were both produced by Yokoi, but Miyamoto was conspicuously absent from the reimagining. So where was Miyamoto? Despite pushing Yokoi to make Virtual Boy in the first place, and saying he wanted to blow people away with new experiences, he never got around to it. He was just too busy with Nintendo's other 3D machine. Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64 were both behind schedule. Zelda 64 was having problems, and meanwhile, he was overseeing quite a few other projects as well, including Pokémon, which at this point was 5 years behind schedule. Nintendo had overloaded Miyamoto with too many projects, and as a result, he didn't have a single second left over for Virtual Boy. In fact, the entire company was stretched thin, working on N64, Game Boy, Super Nintendo, Satellaview, and Virtual Boy all at once. Nintendo executives would later admit this was a bad idea. By now, in October 95, it was clear that Virtual Boy wasn't the explosive hit Nintendo expected. In America, 300,000 people a week were renting them at Blockbusters, but only a tiny percentage followed through with a purchase. So stateside, they dropped the price from $180 down to $160. And despite Nintendo's initial pledge to release a new first-party game every month, by now, they'd only released one since launch. And it was going to be a while till the next one. More third-party games would have helped fill out the schedule, but unfortunately, early on, Yamauchi was worried someone would steal their technology, so he didn't give out dev kits till after it was revealed to the public. As a result, there weren't many games in its first few months. After launch, third parties saw the system wasn't selling, so a lot of them either cancelled their ongoing projects or just didn't bother starting new ones. That left the release calendar pretty barren, which was another reason the system ultimately failed. October only got 2 releases, starting with Virtual Fishing from the same guys who made V-Tetris. It was a pretty straightforward fishing game, with tournaments and 6 areas. Famitsu scored it just shy of a 5, with mixed opinions. One guy said it was fun and looked great, while another called it boring and ugly. Most of them liked the naturalistic visuals, but lamented the lack of naturalistic music to go along with it. Virtual Fishing never left Japan, and neither would this next one. As a first-person survival horror, Innsmouth no Yakuta was arguably the most distinct game on the platform. It also stood out in terms of setting. Instead of the near future, it's the near past. You play as a private eye in 1922, trying to escape a Lovecraftian mansion with randomized monster and item locations. Similar to Jack Bros, every floor has keys to find in a time limit, with one D-pad moving and the other shooting. Famitsu gave it a 6, saying it made great use of VB's controller and 3D, but complained it wasn't scary enough and didn't have enough ammo. Survival horror wasn't really a genre in 1995, so perhaps they didn't realize the low ammo was intentional to make you flee as much as you fight. In recent years, it's garnered a cult following for being weird, and for a Virtual Boy game, a little ahead of its time. November didn't see a single new game. Not even one, on a platform only a few months old. At Space World, President Yamauchi got on stage and proclaimed Virtual Boy a failure. The VB section got pushed to a corner of the expo, with Yokoi made to personally give demos to anyone who happened to walk by. It was far below his station, and widely viewed as his penance for VB's disappointing sales. As Game Informer described it, Nintendo's leadership blamed the failure of the Virtual Boy on Yokoi, and set out to publicly humiliate him. Still, the proud and impeccably dressed Yokoi soldiered on, desperately trying to interest showgoers, who were largely there to see the N64, in his doomed product. Although this sort of punishment is common practice in Japanese business, it was a shabby way to treat a man who had done so much to make Nintendo an industry giant. End quote. Yokoi would ultimately leave Nintendo when all this was over, but we'll get to that later. The next month, December, was the system's last in Japan. Dozens of games had gotten cancelled, leaving just 5 to close out the year. Yokoi's team didn't necessarily need Miyamoto for this one, since they'd already made Mario Land 1, 2, and 3 for Game Boy. In Secret Treasure of the Hourzen, you explore 14 floors of an underground cave, jumping back and forth between the background and foreground to find treasure, solve environmental puzzles, and fight 3D bosses. Not only was it the system's undisputed high point, it was also the last game Nintendo made in-house. Famitsu gave it just short of a 7, saying it's not as good as a big mainline Mario or Zelda, but it is a solid side-scroller with clever 3D effects. It mostly scored 8s in the West, with GamePro going as high as a 9.5. Some magazines thought it'd be a system seller, drawing in millions, though in hindsight, it was just wishful thinking. The same day Virtual Boy got its best game, it also got what Famitsu considered its worst. Space Invaders Virtual Collection. It's just ports of the old arcade games, Space Invaders 1 and 2, plus 3D versions of the same two games. Famitsu scored it less than a 4, saying the old ports were pointless to bring to Virtual Boy, and in the 3D versions, it's hard to even see what's happening. Unsurprisingly, the game never left Japan, and these next 3 didn't either. Virtual Lab's basically Tetris, but with falling organs that you've got to connect together to disappear. Space Invaders was poorly received for not adding anything good to a 1970s arcade game. But Virtual Lab, on the other hand, was just flat out bad. It stunk of being unfinished, and Famitsu gave it a 4, citing the lack of fun, frustrating difficulty, and because, quote, there's no 3D effects, except for a woman swaying breasts in the bottom right corner. If you saw our recent video on the Sufami Turbo, this game will look familiar. Just like the 6SD Gundam games on Turbo, Dimension War's a grid-based tactical RPG similar to Advance Wars and Fire Emblem. On Turbo, battles are just cutscenes, but here, most battles are fought real-time in 3D space. Developers who made VB games generally understood long play sessions were tiring for your eyes, so they stuck to genres you could play in short bursts. Bandai bucked that trend and made a tactics game anyway, but simplified the formula for shorter levels. Famitsu was mixed on the results though, and gave it just under a 5. Virtual Bowling's got multiple modes and bells and whistles, like being able to adjust the weight of your ball and how much wax you want on the lanes. Famitsu gave it a 5.5 for being fun, realistic, and making the best use of VB hardware of any sports title. Besides its great 3D, it also uses both D-pads, one for moving and one for aiming. There's only so much you can do with a bowling game. That said, Virtual Bowling's about as good as it could get on Virtual Boy. And that was it. Only 19 VB games ever released in Japan, and those were the last of them. The same day Gundam and Bowling came out, December 22nd, 1995, Nintendo quietly discontinued the system without announcement. Since launch, they'd only sold a little over 100,000 systems, when they originally thought they were gonna sell millions. Things were going better stateside though. They'd expected to sell around 1 million by now, and they'd achieved 70% of that goal. So in America, VB wasn't discontinued, and got 3 more games into early '96, with plans to continue even longer. The first was Waterworld, based on the film of the same name. You play as Kevin Costner, zipping around on a jet ski shooting pirates, trying to stop them from kidnapping civilians. GamePro magazine said, quote, repetitive sights pollute the water. Identical enemies and victims appear in every level. A bad film makes for an even worse game in this boring shooter. Waterworld is a Virtual Boy's wet nightmare. On average, reviewers gave it a 5. Virtual Bowling never came to America, so they got Nestor's Funky Bowling instead. The game was made in Utah and stars Nestor, who'd been Nintendo Power Magazine's mascot up until 1993. But by 96, he'd long since been retired, making him an odd choice for a bowling game aimed at Americans. In short, it's unremarkable aside from the branding, and not as good as the bowling game they got in Japan. Reviews averaged 5.5, brought up by Nintendo Power's own review of 6.7. The final Virtual Boy game ever released landed on March 22nd, 1996. Americans didn't get V-Tetris, but they did get 3D Tetris. It's basically classic Tetris, but you're looking down from above, with Tetronimos falling into a 5x5 cube. Magazines gave it a 6, with props for good 3D effects, but points off for lackluster sound and music, as well as being less fun than its Game Boy forebear. That was the day Virtual Boy died, though no one knew it yet. For a while, the plan was to regroup and have another go of it in America, considering how much better it was selling than in Japan. A second wave of games was in the works that'd do more to take advantage of the Virtual Boy's unique features. Yamauchi said, "Virtual Boy was created to provide a different kind of gameplay compared to TV games, but it released without any games that took advantage of that distinction. So now I want to return to the starting point and find titles that emphasize the difference that Virtual Boy games can provide. I want to start afresh in 1996. At E3 in May, Nintendo of America renewed their pledge to support the system and announced an aggressive price cut to $99. Games were made cheaper too, down to $30 or $40. NOA projected they would sell another 300,000 systems in the coming year, and showed off a couple games to kick off VB's second wave. The first was Bound High, a top-down action puzzle game that made excellent use of 3D. As Chalvo the robot, you defend Earth from aliens by bouncing around stages on top of enemies to kill them and trying not to fall to your death. Bound High had 4 modes, including a story campaign with bosses every 10 levels. Yamauchi called it the most promising title coming to the system. There was also Dragon Hopper, developed by Intelligent Systems, the studio that did Fire Emblem, Paper Mario, and helped make Super Metroid. It was a top-down action-adventure akin to Zelda Link's Awakening, where you play as Prince Dorin, trying to make his way to the kingdom of Celestia to save his family from its corrupt prime minister. It had everything you'd expect in an adventure game: NPCs, monsters, currency, shops, and so on, but with added 3D. G-Zero was revealed soon after, an F-Zero spin-off where instead of driving on flat roads, you're flying through space, with Captain Falcon and other familiar faces like James McCloud. All 3 games were gonna release soon, and more were in the works as well, like VB Mario Kart, Donkey Kong Country, Bomberman, and a GoldenEye racing game. But then, all of a sudden, it all disappeared. G-Zero, Bound High, and Dragon Hopper were 100% finished. They'd been rated by the ESRB, and according to our sources at NOA, even their boxes and manuals were done. But then Nintendo stuck them in a vault, cut bait, and ran. Every third-party game was cancelled too. Maybe we'll talk about every cancelled Virtual Boy game in a separate video someday, like we did with 64DD. There's about 40, which is too many to cover here in sufficient detail. The upshot, though, is that Nintendo decided to push VB out to sea, so they could focus all resources on N64 in hopes of beating Sony in the home console war. Yokoi famously resigned from Nintendo just as all this went down, in August 96. According to legend, that's why he quit, to accept responsibility for VB's failure. But in reality, he wrote an article called Why I Left Nintendo soon after, saying he'd actually wanted to leave for some time. He was going to leave a few years earlier when he turned 50, but stayed a little longer to see Virtual Boy through. At the start of the project, he wanted VR32 to be his farewell gift to Nintendo, and his way of going out on a high note. But when it failed, he quickly threw together blueprints for Game Boy Pocket, since it'd be quick, easy, and a surefire success. It released July 21st, 1996, 1 year to the day after Virtual Boy. Then he left to start his own company, where he could keep making fun inventions like the old days, escape the bit wars, and keep things small, without having to manage a huge department and worry about Nintendo's office politics. It wasn't the same Nintendo it used to be, and he didn't think he belonged there anymore. A few guys from R&D 1 went with him. Together, they designed the Wonder Swan, which was better than Game Boy in basically every way, and was going to sell for a much lower price. But before it came out, he was killed in a tragic car accident. As his longtime protege, Miyamoto personally designed his gravestone and gave the eulogy at his funeral, where he said Yokoi had made Nintendo what it is today. For more on Yokoi, see our recent biographical video covering his full life story. There's so much more to the man than just Virtual Boy, and it's a shame that's what so many remember him for. His legacy extends well beyond his death, up to this very day, in fact. Back to this video's topic though, the Virtual Boy and legacy it left behind. By late 96, clearance shelves were littered with them for as cheap as $20. The old boy never even made it to Europe. Despite its short lifespan, or maybe because of it, a small but passionate fanbase has formed in the decades since. In 2010, they finally got their hands on Bound High, which it turns out really was the system's best game. Nowadays, you can get it in a boxed cartridge or just play on emulator. Something similar happened with an FPS called Faceball a few years later. Fans have also made their own VB games like Star Fox and Mario Kart Virtual Cup, and some cheeky ports as well, like Snatcher and Street Fighter 2. Not to mention lots of original games like Elevated Speed, and right now they're making a Portal-inspired project called Test Chamber. They even made Virtual Boy link cables and modded multiplayer back into games like Mario's Tennis. Nintendo never got around to it, so fans figured they'd do it themselves. Speaking of what Nintendo don't, at a 2013 shareholder meeting, an investor asked if VB games were going to come to Virtual Console on 3DS. President Iwata said he'd think about it, and that, quote, "It was not a commercial success, but some say that it was an attractive and extremely unique product by these standards at that time." Nintendo never ended up doing that either, but fans picked up the slack with their own 3DS emulator pretty recently, actually, playable in 2D or 3D, whichever you prefer. Outside that niche community though, Virtual Boy's gotten a reputation over the years as Nintendo's biggest failure of all time. As we alluded to earlier though, that narrative's a bit overblown. Nintendo 64DD and Satellaview both sold under 100,000 units. Virtual Boy managed to sell around 800,000, which is also more than can be said for Sega VR and Jaguar VR, neither of which ever came out. VB outsold most of its 5th generation competitors too, including Atari Jaguar, Amiga CD32, PCFX, FM Towns Marty, and Bandai Pippin. And also some of that generation's handhelds, like Neo Geo Pocket, Game.com, and Game Boy Light. And that's with Virtual Boy only really being on the market for 5 months. For a while, it was on track to outsell some bigger systems too. In the US, for example, Sega Saturn had twice the marketing budget and launched with a 2-month head start. Nintendo's Howard Lincoln recalls, "In 1995, Virtual Boy sold more product than Saturn did, which says something. I was sorry that certain key executives at Sega left before I was able to deliver the 50-pound bag of dog food to them, they having described Virtual Boy as the dog of the year. We outsold them, and we got out." Which kind of makes you wonder, what if they hadn't got out? That second wave of games would have released, and more people would buy the system, leading to a third wave, and so on. every system's games get better over time, as devs get more experienced with the hardware. Just imagine if 3DS got discontinued 5 months after its rocky launch. It'd be remembered as a failure too, with only a few games worth playing. But Nintendo doubled down, turned things around, and made lemons into lemonade. Virtual Boy never got that chance. Now, having said all that, we're not claiming Virtual Boy wasn't a failure. Because it was, but it's not as bad as people make it out to be these days. And if it hadn't gotten dragged down by regulations and its resources moved over to N64, who knows? VR32 might have become the success Yokoi dreamed of.
Did you know? The Nintendo Entertainment System, or Family Computer in Japan, was almost the world's first online multiplayer gaming system. According to Shigeru Miyamoto, plans for an online multiplayer network were scrapped due to the telecommunication infrastructure at the time not being able to support it. Nintendo eventually released a modern peripheral for the Famicom in Japan, but it wasn't used for gaming. Instead, it was positioned as a device for adults. It allowed users to view and trade stocks, gamble on horse races, and view banking data amongst other things. Due to persistent connection problems and the inability to attract financial savvy users to the child-friendly gaming console, support for the modem was dropped. But according to Nintendo hardware designer Masayuki Yamura, the experience with the Famicom modem helped lead the Super Famicom's Satellaview add-on. The development of the Famicom began in the spring of 1982 under the codename Project Gamecom. Initially, Nintendo's research and development division were interested in creating a system that would allow near one-to-one ports of arcade hits in the home market. In fact, when negotiating with chip manufacturers for their upcoming console, Nintendo brought the arcade version of Donkey Kong as an example of what they wanted, instead of using the other home game consoles as a reference. Ultimately, the final CPU chosen for the Famicom's hardware was different from what Nintendo used in their arcade machines. This meant that the porting process of arcade games wouldn't be as simple as converting the pre-existing program. The games had to be recreated from scratch. In the case of Donkey Kong, designers meticulously examined every pixel of the arcade screen and measured the timing of animations with a stopwatch. The outer design of the Famicom was given the color red by request of Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi, because it was the color of his favorite scarf. The console's eject button, which would cause cartridges to pop out, was suggested by designer Gunpei Yokoi. It served no practical purpose and was simply added because he thought children would like it. The Famicom came with 2 controllers hardwired into the back of the unit. This was done in an effort to reduce costs, but the decision was made after initial plans to add controller connection ports to the front. Remnants of this can be found inside the system, as the controller wires actually connect in the front of the circuit board, but are extended out to the back internally. More early plans for the Famicom's controllers included arcade-like joysticks, but Nintendo eventually settled on using their patented D-pad from the Game & Watch portables. In fact, at one point, a Game & Watch unit was gutted and wired to the board of the Famicom prototype as a controller for testing. Like the Game & Watch, early releases of the Famicom controller came with soft, rubbery buttons, but these soft buttons wore down easily, causing Nintendo to update the controllers with hard, round buttons. Concerns over degradation also informed the design of the game cartridges. Nintendo worried about the physical quality of the cartridge pins because of the bad experiences with faulty connections and abrasion in their arcade units. So, rather than using pre-existing connection technology, Nintendo developed their own custom hardware. However, this meant that they had to test the connections themselves. This resulted in a period where employees were tasked to insert and remove games over 5,000 times in a row to ensure the cartridges wouldn't degrade for average users. Because of different cultures and expectations, Nintendo made drastic changes to the Famicom when releasing it overseas. Unlike Japan, North America experienced a monumental video game market crash in 1983, and retailers were unsure about the viability of home consoles in the region. Nintendo's first console unveiling for North America came at the Las Vegas Consumer Electronics Show in 1983, and was met with criticism. At this time, the console was renamed the Nintendo Advanced Video Systems. The new name and design was chosen to distinguish the system from other gaming consoles, partially due to the poor reputation video games garnered from the market crash. One change in the design ended up causing internal damage to many NES consoles over time. The Famicom's cartridge slot was changed to a front-loading cartridge socket on the NES. This was in an effort to more closely associate the system with a common household item, the VCR. However, the force of repeatedly pressing cartridges down caused extra wear and tear, leading to glitches and system failures. Many gamers reacted to these problems by blowing into the cartridges to clean them. This did nothing at best because it failed to address the real problem. And at worst, the moisture from the player's breath actually sped up corrosion and the tarnishing of the copper connectors. On the marketing side of things, Rob, the robotic operating buddy, and the NES Zapper were included in various bundles to help sell the system as a toy. This was another effort to disassociate the NES with other video game systems. The Japanese version of the NES Zapper, the Famicom Gun, is slightly different. It was originally released with the game Wild Gunman and is based on a revolver-style handgun. The way the Famicom Gun and NES Zapper actually functions is similar to a camera. When the trigger is pressed, the screen goes black for a single frame. If the Zapper's light sensor didn't detect any light, it goes on to the next step. On the next frame, the screen displays a white square where the target is. If the gun's sensor detects the square, then it registers it as a hit. If it fails one of the tests, it registers as a miss. Rob worked very similarly and communicated via optical sensors and flashes from the television. Because of differing refresh rates, both the NES Zapper and Rob only work with CRT televisions, not with LCD or plasma screen TVs. The NES and Famicom had more interesting peripherals. Nintendo experimented using 3D visuals with a stereoscopic headset called the Famicom 3D system. The headset caused nausea and headaches. It wasn't commercially successful, and it was never released outside of Japan. Another unreleased peripheral was aimed at a different audience. Nintendo once planned a knitting add-on for the NES called the Nintendo Knitting Machine. Outside of North America and Japan, the NES made its debut in a variety of other regions, both officially and unofficially. In South Korea, the system was distributed by Hyundai Electronics under the name Comboy. This was due to a trade embargo South Korea enacted on Japan after World War II. An unofficial clone of the Famicom was sold in China under the guise of an educational system. At the time, the Chinese government had a ban on recreational video games. The clone was known as the Little Tyrant, and the system was endorsed by film star Jackie Chan in commercials and promotional material. In 1992, Russia and other former members of the Soviet Union saw the release of the Taiwan-manufactured Dendy system. It was an unofficial hardware clone of the NES, and nearly its entire library of games were bootlegs of NES and Famicom games. By 1994, over 1 million Dendys were sold at a price of roughly $35 per unit. One last bit of trivia about the Famicom comes from its home country. Nintendo of Japan continued to support the 1983 console for nearly a quarter of a century. It wasn't until 2007 that Nintendo of Japan announced that they would no longer repair Famicom systems, and it was only due to the increasing shortage of necessary parts.